Abzu is going to be a tough one for me to review, for many reasons. It's wonderfully art house with a style all of its own, it has minimal gameplay elements to talk about, the story is so notably ambiguous that each player could take something totally different from it, and it's essentially a spiritual successor to my favourite game of all time, Journey, a game whose qualities I still struggle to put into words to this day. So because of this, I'll answer the question from the off. No, it's not as good as Journey. Despite Matt Nava aiming for a similar experience, Abzu is just lacking that sense of clear-cut direction and distinct tone that Journey carried through to its endpoint. Is it a bad game? Absolutely not. Is it different enough to distinguish itself from its muse? In many ways, yes. Abzu's art style is what separates it most of all from Journey. Whilst both games share a similar cel-shaded design, Abzu's colour palette is astonishingly rich with variety, as it should be of course, this is the ocean after all. But it's the layout and structure of so many of its levels that make each one truly distinct and memorable. Having played through the game twice, I could quite confidently tell you which part of the game one screenshot is from, such is the variety of detail attributed to each section. There are genuinely scenes throughout Abzu that took my breath away. From its awe-inspiring set pieces to its more nonchalant moments spent exploring, there is always an element of tear-jerking beauty to its design. Something must also be said for the quality of its animation. There were times when I simply stopped to watch swimming patterns of schools of fish. Then I discovered that there was no pattern. The fish seemed to move independently of themselves, often influenced by some of the predatory responses of larger fish swimming through them, scooting in all directions to avoid being caught. It genuinely feels like a living, breathing ecosystem at times. Another aesthetic quality it shares with Journey is the distinct juxtapose between the natural and the mechanical, which, given that Abzu is slightly less abstract in its overall art direction, feels even more prominent and jarring here. There is one section towards the end of the game where you have to navigate a series of terrifying machines, whose nature and behaviour I'll not disclose here as it's best left for you to discover. Being confronted with such inconsistent and seemingly alien constructs amongst such a beautiful simulation of the ocean was instantly jarring and oftentimes had me sweating with anxiety to be rid of them, a feeling I'm sure the developers were mindful of inflicting upon me. Of course, a beautiful world is wholly negligible if the control scheme devised to peruse it isn't intuitive. Because so much of the art direction directly informs the player's pathways through each level, not to mention the sheer amount of narrative exposition given through its environment, a simple control scheme is absolutely necessary. Much like Journey, the controls are elegantly straightforward, if not slightly more layered in Abzu given that there are a few more planes of movement underwater. Nevertheless, the control scheme is such that almost anybody with even the most basic knowledge of how games work could get to grips with it in just a few minutes. Interaction with the world is just as simple. Much like Journey, you have a chime that's used to interact with creatures or objects in the world, though for me this is one of the areas the game falls short of its spiritual predecessor. Not only that it borrows so blatantly, but also the way it's implemented. The chiming system in Journey served an infinitely more elegant purpose, not least of all being the only means of communication between players. In Abzu, it doesn't feel quite so necessary. Not to say that it's bad as such, chiming to attract huge schools of fish to swim alongside me never quite got old, but that's the only real purpose it has outside of basic interaction needed to solve puzzles, which in and of themselves are fairly basic and brief throughout. However, just being in Abzu's world was enough to keep me hooked, though of course that may not be enough for other players with similar feelings towards its gameplay. Now this would be a shameful review if I were not to at least mention Austin Wintory's incredible score. The guy has been my favourite composer for quite a while now, and Abzu's soundtrack is without a doubt amongst his best work yet. Wintory has the ability to match visual atmosphere of a scene down to a T with his music, the deep spine-tingling swells coming in at just the right moments, only aiding one's sense of involvement and purpose in the world. Even if you're not planning on playing Abzu, I highly recommend you check out its soundtrack or indeed any of Wintory's previous work. Overall, my time spent with Abzu was fantastic. Despite the game trying that little bit too hard to be a follow-up to Journey, it gets enough of its mimicry correct in order to stick the landing. Some may very well say it tried that little bit too hard in this respect, but for me, Abzu is somewhat its own journey. It does just enough to differentiate itself and create its own identity with its art direction, which carries with it some very distinctly emotional story beats in its own right. However, you cannot argue that both Journey and Abzu have a way of telling a story that is stupendously nuanced and definitive. Truly unique experiences.